I often get asked about the relationship between dyslexia and intelligence. And just a very quick word about this, because it's a really complex relationship, and I'm going to go through it very quickly. So the first thing to say is that dyslexia is counted as what they call a specific learning difficulty, difference, advantage, disability, whatever you call that last bit, but a specific learning difference in that respect. And what that means is that there are certain parts of the brain, certain cognitive functions that we have that are affected by dyslexia. And these can be affected negatively or they can be affected positively. So the first thing to say is that, generally speaking, when we talk about dyslexia and intelligence, we have to separate the idea of, well, phonological processing from the rest of it. So in other words, actually, if you're dyslexic, you may have, let's say, phonological processing issues, but you won't have other difficulties. And so, generally speaking, your intelligence won't be affected. Your IQ won't be affected. This is what they say. And in fact, depending on where you're tested for dyslexia and how they measure it, this is really interesting because different places test differently and they measure those tests differently. So depending on where you're tested and how they measure it, you might actually get very interesting results. Here's one result you might get. It may be that some diagnosticians measure dyslexia so that if you are generally of a low intelligence, for instance, your phonological processing isn't great, your working memory isn't great, and other things aren't very good either, then they can't classify you or categorize you as dyslexic. So a lot of the time, dyslexic people will be classified and categorized as dyslexic when they are, generally speaking, of average intelligence and above. So if you're significantly below, or if you're what you might call below average intelligence, a lot of the time it's very difficult for some diagnosticians, because of the way they test it, to categorize you as dyslexic. So that's one thing. A lot of dyslexics are at least average intelligence or above. And you'll actually get some people who are diagnosed as dyslexic being incredibly intelligent, but with, if you like, negative spikes on working memory, rapid automatized naming, phonological processing, that kind of thing. So the relationship between dyslexia and intelligence is actually, in that respect, a relatively positive one. Dyslexics often will come out in intelligence tests as quite intelligent. The next thing to say is that actually, depending on the type of intelligence test you use, dyslexics may come out as very intelligent. So in a number of studies, dyslexics have been found to have higher levels of what you might call interpersonal intelligence, or, if you like, emotional intelligence in certain respects as well. So depending on the way that you measure it and what you're measuring, people with dyslexia may actually have higher levels of intelligence than those who aren't dyslexic. Creative intelligence, for instance, is something that dyslexics tend to excel at. But it's not all good news, because look, I don't buy the whole 7 types of intelligence, 9 types of intelligence, 13 types of intelligence type narrative. I get very suspicious when I hear that kind of conversation. Partially because these types of intelligences, these categories, these categorizations are our categorizations. And we generally categorize according to our own aims and purposes. And our own aims and purposes change, and they're culturally specific. And so different cultures may have different aims and purposes. So, I mean, there's a whole complexity of issues around the types of intelligence that always make me extremely suspicious. But what we do know about intelligence is that, generally speaking, when somebody does intelligent things, they're usually joining the dots. And this is something that you'll notice about, for instance, Kate Griggs is Made by Dyslexia. You know, that they've got this idea of the dots. You're joining the dots. And you're joining the dots between this piece of information, this fact, this theory you've understood, this question that you've heard, that kind of thing. So you're joining the dots between all of these different things. And this is the workings of intelligence. It's not just one thing that happens in one part of the brain. It's when you join the dots. It's when you bring things together. It's when you ask original questions based on putting 2 pieces of information together that haven't been placed together before, that kind of thing. So this is one of the important ways in which we describe intelligence. The problem with this for dyslexic people is that, look, when you're at school, when schooling is about reading, when it's about producing writing, when it's about working memory, when it's about memorizing things, these are the things that dyslexic people typically don't do terribly well. And if school's about that, then we won't learn as much as people who aren't dyslexic. Now, because we don't learn as much as people who aren't dyslexic, it means we don't have as many dots to join. We might be able to join them really well. We might be able to join them in really wonderful, out-of-the-box ways, but we don't have quite as many dots to join. And therefore, the schooling system actually drags down our intelligence potential. And this is something which we really need to address, because if we talk about, oh, dyslexia, it's a specific learning difficulty, it's not to do with global intelligence, and then we teach dyslexic kids in such a way that they're not going to learn as much, then they're not going to be able to join the dots as much. They're not going to be able to make these intelligent jumps, these leaps of creativity, and they're not going to be as intelligent. They're not going to reach that intelligence threshold that they're otherwise capable of reaching. So what we need to do is, when we ask about dyslexia and intelligence, we need to then ask back. We need to look back to school. We need to look back to what we're doing to kids at school and how our schooling methods are affecting the ability of kids to ask intelligent questions and produce intelligent solutions. Because if we don't do that, then it becomes harder and harder for us ever to say that dyslexia is only a specific learning difference. Dyslexics become, as it were, the victims of the school's teaching methodologies, of the exam systems we have to live through. And because of that, there's a danger that the global intelligence of dyslexic people gets dragged down.